Good evening or good morning. The people entering the room the speed has stopped, so it is a good time to begin. And I'm going to assume that more people will filter in during my less important introductory remarks before we get to the meat of the discussion. So good morning or evening or afternoon, depending on where in the world you are joining us from. My name is Tyrell Haberkorn, and I'm a professor of Southeast Asian Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to this evening's roundtable, which we've titled Unburied Histories, John Roosa's Buried Histories, the Anticommunist Massacres of 1965-66 in Indonesia, and the Urgency of History, which was published in the Critical Human Rights series at the University of Wisconsin Press, which I co-edit with Scott Strauss. Interdisciplinary in nature, the series publishes empirically grounded and theoretically innovative work. The series emphasizes research that opens new ways to conceptualize and examine human rights. Books in the series aim to transcend simplified accounts of perpetrators and victims, resist triumphalist narratives, emphasize the importance of local perception, incorporate socioeconomic rights, and anticipate human rights problems of the future. Tonight's event, or this morning's event, is a special event organized by the Critical Human Rights series and the Justice in Southeast Asia Lab, or the JSEALab. The JSEALab is part of a 5-year initiative on social justice housed in the Center for Southeast Asian Studies and the Human Rights Program at UW-Madison and generously funded by the Henry Luce Foundation. A combination of intensive exchange between faculty and graduate students and public-facing events that aim to foster significant collaboration between academics and practitioners, the JSEALab reflects both the recognition that a growing number of MAs and PhDs in Southeast Asian studies are choosing to pursue professional careers outside the university, and that there is a need for academic work to be directly responsive to ongoing social justice crises in the region. We're currently publishing an online open access translation series, Justice in Translation. Other activities also include an online lecture series. We actually have 4 lectures in April, beginning this week on Wednesday evening in North America, Thursday morning in Southeast Asia, on authoritarian legacies in the Philippines. We have an online reading group and additional exchange activities between scholars and practitioners in Southeast Asia and North America. And for information on all of these activities, or to join us by submitting a translation, by attending the lectures, by applying to be a visitor, please either check our website, and I'll put the link in the chat, or follow us on Facebook or Twitter to get notices about upcoming events and activities. And now it is my great pleasure to introduce this evening's event. John Roosa's extraordinary book, Buried Histories, was co-awarded the 2023 George McT Kahin Award by the Association for Asian Studies. The award is given for the best book beyond the first book by the Southeast Asia Council of the Association. Buried Histories is extraordinary for many reasons. As John Roosa explains in his introduction, as he did in an earlier essay, scholarship on the 1965-66 killings in Indonesia has been marred by a profound lack of understanding regarding perpetrators and methods. Until his work, the commonly held understanding or misunderstanding was that the killings were somewhat spontaneous, varied across the archipelago, and were carried out by citizens who had run amok with some involvement from the military. But instead, the killings were systematic and planned from the top. The systematic nature of the killings across the archipelago is part of why the effects on the victims and their descendants is so profound. In his extraordinary book, John Roosa combines rich sources with a focus on what he writes as, quote, the subjectivity of both the perpetrators and the victims at the time of the violence. And what I think is so significant and what to me makes it very important as a book in the Critical Human Rights series is that he both shows with tremendous empirical depth how this happens in the case of the 1965-66 killings in Indonesia, but also provides the outline of a methodology of how to do so that is useful for scholars working on resonant questions in other contexts. What I find most compelling and most moving about the book is that it's filled with the stories of ordinary Indonesians, ordinary people who were affected by what happened, by including their stories, by naming them. It is this incredible counter to the Suharto regime's attempt to eliminate their lives and eliminate their memory. So to discuss this book and why it matters, and to celebrate the book being awarded the Kahin Prize, we have a roundtable of scholars who will speak about the book and why it matters. So first, we are thrilled to have John Roosa, the author, who is joining us from the Department of History at the University of British Columbia. Then we will have Gede Sri Pratiwi joining us from the Department of History and the JSEALab at UW-Madison. Then Chris Hulshof from the Department of History at UW-Madison and Gede. Then Veronika Kusumaryati from the Department of Anthropology and International Studies at UW-Madison. And then John will engage with the comments from the other panelists, and then we'll open the floor to a Q&A. So I just want to say, please feel free to put your questions and comments in the Q&A, the written Q&A box, whenever you would like. And the event will end it'll go for between 75 to 90 minutes, sort of no more than 90 minutes, just to give people a sense of where we are going. And so now, John, let me pass the screen to you. Thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much for the opening remarks, Tyrell, and also for organizing this. For my opening remarks, I'm just going to keep it brief since I'll have an opportunity later to comment on what the other three speakers will be saying about the book. And so I'm more curious to know about what their response is to the book. So I'll just say something about what's going on behind the book instead of going through the arguments, instead of kind of restating the argument. I want to say something about how it was written in the first place. And because the book took a long time, there was a long gestation period, and it went through many different sort of I had different kinds of organizing principles, and it, given the nature of the event, the massacres, it was really difficult just to find enough information about them to put together a coherent book. And so the source material was very fragmentary and was of many different types. And so it's incredible, really, when you think about it. This is such a large-scale event, and hundreds of thousands of people were killed, and yet we know really so little about any of the details. And there's so little information that's available in comparison to just about every other large-scale mass violence of this type. Whether 100 years ago, I think there's more information on the Armenian genocide than there is on just what happened 50 years ago in terms of government documents that have been available, personal memoirs, eyewitness testimony, testimony of bystanders and so forth. It's just little. We just can't avoid recognizing that. It's not something that's available, that you can just go to a library already and pick up a whole bunch of material and books and papers and so forth. There's no archive to go to. So we had to create our own archive by interviewing people, and even those interviews were kind of fragmentary on their own. For instance, many of the people we interviewed were ex-political prisoners, and they saw their fellow prisoners being taken out and disappearing. and never being heard from again. But they didn't understand anything about who is responsible for that. Why is it going on? Why are these people being chosen and not me? How did I survive? There's so many stories like that, and that just haven't come out. And there's stories from the families. They go to the prison to deliver food, and they're told, your father, wife, son, father are not here, and they've been moved, and there's no further information. They have those stories, but they didn't know where the person was, whether they were actually killed, and if they were killed, where they were. This was meant to be a non-event, and so researching it was very difficult. You'll notice that I'm using different source material in different chapters. I wrote 2 chapters on Bali because in Bali there were 2 things. One was there was a newspaper, a local newspaper published. There weren't local newspapers published in other parts. In Surakarta, there's no local newspaper that at least has survived, be available now. In Sumatra as well, and in South Sumatra as well as in Riau, I couldn't find any local papers. So the Bali situation was somewhat unique with that newspaper. And then also I was able to do a case study of one massacre. And I think that's the kind of thing that needs to be done, but I didn't do it elsewhere. I think I wish I had done it elsewhere, but so the book is actually uneven because it's, I'm relying upon different types of source material. For South Sumatra, there was an interview with the former perpetrator, and we didn't have those kinds of interviews. It was a very detailed, lengthy interview done by a colleague of mine about the methods of killing there in South Sumatra from the perpetrator's perspective, but we didn't have that in other parts of, although in Bali I had interviewed some perpetrators, but they didn't proclaim themselves as perpetrators. So so this kind of research requires a lot of time, and it's academics today, with the pressure of publication, find it really difficult to devote this kind of time to, for really understandable reasons, to put together all of these different kinds of materials and work through it. And it requires quite a lot of work, the work of interpretation, of reading silences, of cross-checking information. And I think part of the reason why the historical literature hasn't been all that good about the killings until recent years, when we got works by Jess Melvin, but within Indonesia, the historical profession is really in dire straits, and it has been. It was really shaped by the 32 years of the Suharto regime, and they just are flat-footed. Sorry, that might be an ableist term. I'm flat-footed myself, actually. But they're really unable to handle. They're not prepared to handle the kind of difficulties of dealing with an event that was meant to be a non-event, where the evidence has been, so suppressed. But I think that's where research is going to have to go, and there's so much more that needs to be done on this, and we are faced with so many pressures that militate against this, whether it's in Indonesia, the state of the historical profession there, or here in Canada and United States, where humanities are in decline, the enrollments are declining, graduate student enrollments are declining, funding is declining, and so forth. So, but yet this is we see, these huge events that have been so important to people's lives and have shaped whole societies, and yet we're still at the beginning stages of trying to get a grip on. So I'll end there.
Thank you so much. Let me pass the screen now to Shri.
Okay. Thank you, Tyrell, for organizing this panel. I feel so honored to join this wonderful group to discuss this wonderful book. So I will not talk about the book through the academic lens because I believe my colleagues Chris and Veronika will be better at it than I am. I just want to share my personal reflections as an Indonesian and as a Balinese who was unfortunate enough to be in primary school during the New Order era. I was enrolled in a Sekolah Dasar Impres, or the government elementary school for lower class people in a small village in Denpasar. We only learned history in 3rd grade, but we were taught to be nationalists from 1st grade. Every year on October 1st, we would have a mandatory flag ceremony for the Hari Kesaktian Pancasila. There was no classroom activity on that day. We went home and studied at home. Of course, kids don't study at home on a Hari Libur or national holiday like that. We wanted to watch TV, all the Japanese anime that we like Doraemon or Dragon Ball. And I remember this was one of the national days that I didn't like, other than Independence Day and the day when Ibu Tin Suharto died. It's not because I was a bad Indonesian. I was an uber nationalist kid back then. But on those days, all the TV stations would broadcast events at the President Palace all day long. There was no Doraemon or Power Rangers when those days fell on the weekend. But late September or the first day of October was the worst. We had to watch a very long film on Pemberontakan G30 SPKI, or the September 30th PKI rebellion movement. Worst thing was that you couldn't run away from it. Before sending us home, our school teachers would remind us to watch this film. So even though 1st and 2nd grades had not studied history in school, they were exposed to this specific event in Indonesia's past. Thank God I only had to watch it 3 years in a row. After that, the film somehow disappeared from my reality. I think my generation was the last one who had to watch this film as a part of their education. But 3 years was enough to carve a memory in little children's brain. I still remember the image of the communists training in the foresty place in their uniform with their guns and chanting their communist motto. My imagination of PKI was almost like Guevara or Castro's guerrilla groups. I still remember the scenes when they came to the generals' houses and some were shot in their house and some were taken to be tortured. And the little girl who got shot, her father who ran away. And then the scene where the bodies of the generals were taken out from the ground where they were buried by the communists. I learned in 3rd grade that G30 SPKI was when the communists killed the generals and then they were crushed by the ABRI, or Indonesian Army. The PKI were people who were really cruel. They were atheists and they didn't believe in Pancasila. They were the villains and the army were the heroes. It was a dark and scary history, but to my little brain, it was just another Indonesian history that had nothing to do with me. It was the history of Jakarta, the history of Java that started and ended within a few days in late September and early October of 1965. When I was little, my mom and dad used to tell me some bizarre stories about their childhood in their villages in Bali. It's really ugly stories. They used to tell me in the Balinese language, Dugas Gestok, or during the time of Gestok. People's houses were burned, dead bodies were on the street, and people had to run and hide. My mother was a little girl back then. Her sister took her to hide in a temple on top of the hill, but she didn't understand hiding. Her sister had to hit her in the head multiple times to tell her to shut up. They also told me the story about an old man that I knew who lived near the rice field that I used to visit in Paguyangan village, north of Denpasar. That friendly old man, we called him Pekak Kacret or Grandpa Kacret, was a tameng when he was younger. And he drank blood of the people he killed, so they won't haunt him. For some reason, I failed to connect Gestok and G30S. To me, they were two unrelated events. I don't recall if my school textbook ever mentioned Gestok, Tameng, and the bloodshed all over the country. They only said the PKI had been crushed by the ABRI. And my parents didn't say PKI when they told me those stories. Part of me even thought that the stories that my parents told me were not 100% true. They might have been made up to scare me. Until sometimes in the late 2000s, I was shown an early edit of the documentary film by Robert Lemelson called 40 Years of Silence. And by the way, that was the first time I saw John Roosa. He was interviewed in that film. That was the moment when I finally saw the clear connection between the two stories. As you can tell, before this moment of enlightenment, I was a product of the New Order's successful propaganda. I didn't understand what communism meant, but I knew PKI were bad people. I believe I am not a special case here. There must be thousands, if not millions of Sri out there who see the New Order's propaganda as the ultimate truth. When I read Unburied Histories, I was brought back to those images and stories, but this time they are fully connected. I did learn about the history through readings and classes I took here in UW-Madison, but this book brought me even deeper into who, why, and how the genocide happened. The background, the events, and the connection between the Java or central history and the local histories of the 65-66 genocide are told in a very digestible way. To me, this book has successfully helped me to close the distance I often felt between national history and the history of the Balinese. So, Pak John, I really appreciate how you tell history in such an accessible language. I wish Indonesian textbooks were as good and clear as this book. I would have studied history instead of English for my undergrad. Anyway, I think this book is very important and urgent to help people like me, not only to understand the 65, but also to own it and acknowledge it. I hope many Indonesians can read this book and have access to other research on these buried histories. Part of the aftermath chapter of this book talks about the symposium where Luhut Panjaitan said that Indonesia could make peace with its past. But there are many of us who don't even know the truth of the past. People cannot forgive if they don't know what to forgive. And you cannot just tell someone like Ibu Sumini and others to move on and make peace with the past after the injustice they had to suffer. At the very least, she deserves to get a truthful answer to her question, what was my crime? So I think I and other Indonesians deserve to know the truth so we can fairly and justly assess our stand before we can talk about reconciliation. I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sri. Let me pass the screen to Chris.
All right. So firstly, I'd like to thank Tyrell for putting this event together. We are extremely fortunate to have her as one of the editors for the Critical Human Rights series at the University of Wisconsin Press, and lucky to have her at UW-Madison in general, to be honest. I do not embellish when I say that everything Tyrell touches turns to gold. And of course, thank you to John for the years and years of work required to bring such a meaningful manuscript to the Critical Human Rights series. Now, I can't say that I am fortunate enough to know if John has Tyrell's Midas touch in all of his endeavors, but I can say with great confidence that everything he writes seems to truly be gold. So most of us know John's name because of his last book, that absolute landmark study entitled The Pretext for Mass Murder, which was also published by UW Press, go UW Press. And certainly not to diminish from the rest of his remarkable lineup of work, from 2004's Tahun Yang Tak Pernah Berakhir to an impressive list of referee journal articles. But Pretext for Mass Murder was something truly special. It was, in my opinion, the conclusion of a 4-decade-long debate on what exactly happened in Indonesia on the night of September 30th, 1965. And in the near 2 decades since its release, it has been the go-to text on that subject. And for all intents and purposes, it likely will stay that way for decades to come. Pretext was that seminal work that all scholars wish to produce at some point during their career, like that work which you can look back at and just be proud of at the end of the day, that work which will forever etch them in a place of prominence in the field. So when Buried Histories came out, nobody in their right mind expected a manuscript as engaging or impactful as Pretext. That just wouldn't be fair. Yet here we are, gathering to discuss this Kahin Prize-winning book, which is just that. Buried Histories is 300 some odd pages, masterfully composed through meticulous, assiduous research, weaved together through compelling and often heart-wrenching narratives. Buried Histories is not merely an equal to Pretext for Mass Murder, but something much, much more that will be referred to by scholars for a generation, but also has the capacity to impact the lives of real people in Indonesia and beyond. And that's not to say that scholars aren't real people, but I digress. So as a student of history, my mind is naturally inclined, first and foremost, to recognize the book's contribution to the field. Not as entertaining a street story, but it is just how my brain works. And while we usually go into such things and discuss a contribution to the field, to me, Buried History has quite a few contributions to bring up. The first, most obvious contribution, I believe, was to help us construct a model for the mass killings as a whole through an analysis of the significance of details within individual localities, which is a task which seems obviously necessary, yet remained daunting to scholars for decades following these events. And that was in no small part due to the response of the New Order government in Jakarta, which kept matters vague as possible as a matter of policy. So when state historians like Nugroho Noto Susanto and Ismail Sala addressed the killings in official histories, they maintained the line that the killings emerged from the ground level chaos which the army, of course, put an end to. And as scholarship on the killings emerged in the years after that, from Malcolm Caldwell's edited volume in 1975, Robert Cribb's edited volume, 1990. We can look at Clifford Geertz, 1996, Christian Gerlach, 2010, Tawfiq Abdul, 2012, we can go on and on. A paradigm emerged which explained the mass murders through the lens of local conflicts, right? A paradigm which mirrored the official line out of Jakarta, which at best was wisely taken with a grain of salt by scholars such as Cribb, but at worst, wholeheartedly adopted by others such as Geertz. And that paradigm didn't really fully shift until 2018, with 2 excellent studies by Jess Melvin and Jeff Robinson. Melvin's book, The Army and the Indonesian Genocide, provides a close-grained analysis of the killings in Aceh, which had long been the clearest example of civilian-led killings. And instead, she demonstrated the exact opposite, that the army both initiated and organized the massacres there. And Melvin in that book coined the two-stage process as the mechanics of mass murder. First, public murders in the streets resulted in PKE-affiliated civilians turning to the police for protection. Then, once behind bars, seemingly for their own protection, the second stage unfolded when these unarmed prisoners were summarily executed en masse. Now, Jeff Robinson's book, The Killing Season, takes a bird's eye view of the killing to assert that the violence could not have reached such a fevered pitch without army authorization, organization, and, of course, assistance. But by redirecting the source of the mass killings to the army itself, Robinson explained the different levels of violence throughout the country as largely a result of regional army commanders' differing understandings of that central command to crush the PKE itself. Now, John humbly describes Buried Histories as covering the middle ground between Melvin and Robinson's book by analyzing the nation-level pattern of violence and presenting case studies of 4 regions. However, Buried Histories does far more than that, while certainly not falling into the local conflicts paradigm at all. John nuances Melvin and Robinson's studies of the army-directed murders to bring forth the agency of local actors. His case studies, particularly those involving Sumatra, showcase how civilians were able to redirect the army-led violence towards their enemies under the guise of anti-communism. So whether it was landlords in Bali seeking to eliminate their enemies in tenant rights organizations, or oil interests in Sumatra seizing the opportunity to liquidate troublesome labor units, civilians maneuvered to ameliorate their own idiosyncratic agendas by throwing their adversaries into that army-led killing machine. And at a time when victims of the mass murders and their families are still being ostracized, even demonized throughout Indonesia, the case studies of Buried History definitively prove that which many of us have long assumed, that many non-PKE affiliated civilians simply fell victim to the massacres. Now, another of John's contributions lies in the realm of genocide studies. The case studies within Buried Histories brings forth a group of actors John calls the resistors as crucial additions to the traditional perpetrator, victim, bystander triadic paradigm of genocide studies. And in doing so, he explains both the temporal gaps between the initiation of the killings in various regions, but also the difference in the sheer velocity of killings between regions that otherwise would look the same. So thus, John again weaves a very necessary nuance into the interlocking narratives of local and nationwide events. And yet another contribution of Buried Histories is John's answer to the question of how exactly did the supporters of the PKE, the largest communist party in the world outside of Soviet Union and China, find themselves in such a vulnerable position to become victimized in such large numbers and destroyed so quickly with such little resistance. So John tackles this question first through a novel approach to the history of the Army's territorial command structure and their rivalry with the PKE during the years of guided democracy. And through a Gramscian framework of analysis, John's able to detail how both organizations fought a war of position to occupy key sites in Indonesia's civil society and state bureaucracy. And while the army consolidated power across the country, building its capacity as an army of occupation, PKE leaders became supremely confident in their strategy of burrowing within the army, turning officers to the cause, and using the army's infrastructure to their own needs, a confidence which proved unfounded as the army rank and file fell in line with Suharto's group of officers after those events of September 30th. So John then turns his gaze to the role of propaganda and torture in neutering the PKE's ability to maneuver. First, through seizing control of the media in the first days of October, the army was able to effectively mute Sukarno's call for calm while whipping up a sense of war-fueled hysteria through the country. And the subsequent torture of prisoners to force confessions was then used to bolster the credibility of that army propaganda, resulting in the cooperation in or acceptance of the mass killings throughout the country. And that last point on torture is yet another contribution John has made through Buried Histories. The standard critique made by those in the field of interrogational torture is that such measures produce false and unreliable information. It's an argument we've heard many times. And in essence, torture is counterproductive, right? But here, John outlines how interrogational torture was the opposite of what it claims to be, not the extraction of information from prisoners, but the imposition of information through prisoners. So through the torture, forced confessions became the locus for the reaffirmation of the state's propaganda, helping spread and sustain what John calls a fantasy world, which enabled the mass violence to continue. A valuable assessment, which once again makes tangible that very contrived demonization of the PKE and sheer volume of non-PKE civilians who were caught up in the killing machine itself. And I could probably go on fawning about the contributions of the book. It's just how my brain works. But I am out of time. So let me briefly bring us back to the focal point of this gathering, which is the urgency of history. So John's book, the introduction, opens with the story of a man named Ibnu Sentoro, a graduate of UW-Madison who was murdered and dumped in a mass grave in central Jakarta. Now, my first introduction to Ibnu Sentoro was through the documentary film some years ago, a film called Shadow Play, which showed the obstacles which his brother faced exhuming Ibnu's body. So despite Ibnu not being a communist, not a member of the PKE, being educated in America, very much not PKE, his family faced obstacles both from the government and then actually armed groups of civilians who attempted to stop them from digging up the mass grave. It's a scene I recommend everyone here watch, as it really truly embodies that unbridled, unquestioning opposition to anything communist in Indonesia, which persists today. And my Indonesian colleagues can certainly speak to this better than I. Sri just did. I'm sure Veronika will. Many of the audience can speak to this better than I. I am a mere observer from the outside. But it does not take extensive field work or prolonged exposure to Indonesian society to pick up these threads. Like, unless you're literally just traveling to Ubud to find yourself, you will quickly find that Indonesia is still haunted by the aftermath and afterlives of these mass killings. Both the children and grandchildren even of the massacre's victims continue to be ostracized today as their voices are silenced and their families' histories are demonized. So if we want to talk about the urgency of history, it is just that, the actual process of national healing and shifts in cultural paradigms, particularly for societies so profoundly traumatized, is a long and daunting task. And Buried Histories is one of the many urgently needed steps in the right direction to help facilitate that healing. So beyond the many contributions to the field, which I certainly do appreciate, there is something more to Buried Histories, which I appreciate even more. And I am way over time, so I will leave it at that and just say thank you again, John.
Thank you so much, Chris. Let me pass the screen to Veronika.
Thank you so much for the invitation, Tyrell, to speak about the book. Thank you, Papa John, Roosa, who has written this really amazing and very moving book. And I find this conversation today and the book is very emotional for so many reasons that Sri has said. I was also educated in the school of that history, the New Order history. And I would like to comment on the book through at least like two ways. First is the politic of knowledge in regard to this book, in relation also to the discussion of the present. I think secondly, I also want to sit with this book within the long history of the so-called project of pelurusan sejarah, or strengthening the history in Indonesia. And I think the third one is the lesson that I learned from this book, especially pertaining my research in West Papua. So first, I would like to congratulate John Rosa here and Indonesian people because we have one more resource to really understand what has happened in the past. And I think the book is really speak and come from the engagement of the present. And it's not reflected only in the way that is written, but also in the way that is I think read, distributed, and I talk about. So I use the term politic of knowledge here, or politic of history, to talk about not only who write the history and for what purpose, but also how. And the first thing that is very striking from this book is the methodology. I think compared to other like genocide cases in the world, the genocide, the many perpetrators of the killing in Indonesia didn't really document, or even if there is a document, they hide it, or they prohibited like public access to the document. So not only, as Professor Rosa said, that he need to produce archive to do the research, but also the archive that we have on this massacre are fake news. So I think this the very interesting methodology that Professor Rosa uses is like to excavate like this fake news, this propaganda, this untruth, to uncover the truth. So I think it lends itself to not only historian but anthropologists a method to how understand like genocide and like this propaganda apparatus, not only as a as a machinery of murder, but also as resources for archival studies. The second methodology that also is very striking to me is that the history that's written in the book is written with and for survivors, or largely for survivors and victims. The like oral history as a method, I think offer historian kind of like a way to also not only engage with the past that the subject or the informant or the survivor like tell us, but also to the present, to their lives that they are experiencing now. And I think a lot of stories in the book are about the present, about how these many survivors and victims try not to survive, but also challenge the structure of silence in Indonesia. And what I like about this research is I think that it necessitated not only understanding of the present, of Indonesian present, to establish like a long relationship with the subject or the survivor, but also that as historian, Professor Rosa like really informed by the understanding of what some people call trauma-informed history or trauma-informed research. And the notion of trauma here is not only pertaining to the survivors of the family, but the whole nation. The whole nation is actually traumatized by the event in 1965 and after. Secondly, I think the book really raises a lot of interesting questions about the politics of knowledge and the politics of history, precisely because knowledge and history of 1965 is still prohibited or forbidden. So it's not only that it's buried history, but it's also forbidden histories and forbidden knowledge. In regard to that politic, I think the book like really come from a long engagement of a historian, in this case, Professor Roosa, with historian and historical production in Indonesia. So a lot of Indonesian historians have attempted to produce, a project of pelurusan sejarah or strengthening the history. And I think Professor Roosa, like compared to other maybe academic historian, like really invested in building the relationship with Indonesian historian, especially through the collaboration with the Indonesian Institute of Social History. I think it's really worth pointing out that that this project of collaboration is never easy. Especially in academia, it's not properly rewarded because it's just so complicated. I don't know, like you don't have to go through IRB, but for social scientists, you have to go through IRB, and it just asks so much, like energy, generosity, time, resources. So I really appreciate that this research really comes and like really speak to the effort that are carried out by Indonesian historians themselves in covering this history. So I think that's it's very important point to me and very important lesson learned also, especially because of my work in West Papua. So I learned several things from this book. First is, I think, his attention to the structure of the Indonesian military. I really appreciate his attention and agency that he afforded to actors in structure like regional commands. The role of Kodam, Kodim, Korem, and etc. So I think the careful attention to the structure of the of impunity, let's say, and the genocide in the Indonesian military really shed light on how the killing were carried out, or especially the enforced disappearance were carried out. And I think it offered so much for the study of West Papua, precisely because in West Papua, the similar technique, similar agency, like similar line of coordination are used to suppress indigenous Papuan. Secondly, I think the attention to excuse me, attention to the genocidaires and the low-level officers are very useful here. And I think we learn also from other work like the act of killing that those like low-level officers have played both in resisting and supporting the killing in the first place. So I think that the relevance of this book not only, I think, lies in its narrative, the historical narrative, but also larger outside the view of 1965, especially in cases where enforced disappearance and killing are still carried out, in the case of Indonesia, is in West Papua. So I really appreciate the book in those ways, and I think it reminds me of Walter Benjamin statement about the role of historian. I think this book shows that historian, quote, will have the gift of finding the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that often even the dead will not be saved from the enemy if he wins. I think the book shows that the dead now is still win. Even the dead is not safe from the enemies. So thank you so much for writing this book.
Thank you so much, Veronika. And so now let me hand the screen back to John. And just as a reminder, please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A at any time.
So thank you to all three of you for these comments. And there's quite a lot that I want to say, but how much time should I take, Tyrell?
I think you could have 10 to 15 minutes.
Okay.
Would that be okay?
Yeah, I'll try to keep it to 10 minutes and then give us some time to take some questions from the audience as well, listen to what people in the audience have to say. Yeah, as much as history gets derided and demeaned in educational systems in many countries in the world, and gets used as a kind of weapon by authoritarian states to mold a citizenry in a kind of monolithic way. The history remains really important, and I think a lot of people are struggling with figuring out who they are and who are these groups that they are part of or supposed to be a part of. And I think that's really one of the great powers of history. That's why it remains a vital subject. That's why it's urgent, which is the theme of this session, because it responds to people's kind of figures like, who am I? And I'm Indonesian, let's say, and well, what does that mean? Where does so I think the richer content that can be provided or sort of richer answers that can be provided to that question, I think will gain more response from a readership. So I think a lot of Indonesians are like you, Shri, who have been through the schooling and are left with a lot of questions. So say, we've been given this information, but it's only gone so far. And so there's a lot of unanswered issues here. So there's this, I think, a searching there that I'm trying to respond to. I'm trying to help with in collaboration with many Indonesian intellectuals. As Veronika mentioned, I've worked very closely with Ayu Rati, and there's the people I mentioned in the acknowledgements are, they're almost co-authors of the book. That the film studio was found by my colleague Erlene, and she was the one who was brought me there. The train station, the Railway Workers Union building, that was Radzif did quite a bit of research on that. So many of the interviews were done by my colleagues in the Institute as well. So this is, as Veronika mentioned, it's kind of difficult to arrange these collaborations. And I was just very fortunate that it was, when we were conducting the research, it was rather informal. And I was not an academic at the time, meaning I had a PhD, but I was not employed in an institution, and I didn't have other demands on me, and I could focus full time on coordinating the activities of the oral interviewers and sort of processing the interviews that we were getting, and having the time to meet people, hang out with people, and I do, as Veronika mentioned, there's this kind of there's a semi-anthropological aspect to oral history, and just having the time to get to know people, and that too is so so difficult these days for academics that, you know, just this past week, I've been thinking about how one of the responses to the decline of the humanities in the US and Canada has been to propose greater emphasis on more social scientific methods and developing big data sets and manipulating these data sets through these statistical procedures, and then coming up with sort of objective, verifiable conclusions about social processes, historical events, and so forth. And I just think that that may have a place for some things, but especially when you're looking at massacres that were meant to be non-events, there's no data. It's just, you really have to do something else. You have to get out and talk with people. You have to get to know people as well, so you can, and not just give them a survey to fill out either. You have to be able to get to know them as friends, as fellow humans, as fellow creatures on this earth, and be able to understand sort of what they've been through. And I routinely found that the people that we spoke with, when first approached, would say one thing, and that was usually kind of anodyne and not all that interesting, or even misleading. And then as we got to know them better, we began to be more comfortable in speaking with us and building those kinds of relationships of trust. That takes time, and that takes effort as well. And so many of the approaches that we have in academia just go against that. So you know, as much as another sort of anthropological part of the book is there's quite a, I actually am fully in support of interpretive methods in the humanities and social sciences, and that's what Gertz proposed, that's what Gertz was developing. I really dislike Gertz's work on Indonesia, pretty much all of it, in terms of what he had to say about Indonesia. I disagree with just about everything he wrote, but the methodology is actually something I support. I just don't think he implemented it properly in Indonesia. But the idea of really having to interpret social reality and not just accept what you're given and count it up and so forth, but really to think about the meanings of language, of social practices, and so forth. So in the book, I was trying to pack a lot into it, and that's why I thought at times of writing several books and splitting it up, maybe just one book on Bali. There was a lot to talk about there, but the method that I came up was trying to go by chapter, where I said, okay, every chapter has to do something, has to do 3 different things, and one of them is bringing out new information about the history, and sort of the empirical side of historical work, but the other side is the analytical part. Every chapter has an analytical punch, not to use violent rhetoric, but has a violent has a message about violence. And Chris mentioned one about the torture being something that is not an extraction of information, but the imposition of information. So the first chapter about using Gramsci, to understand struggles of hegemony, the meaning of hegemony. Actually, there's a lot more I could have written. I'm thinking about writing been thinking for some time, and I eventually will at some point write more about that. On the whole PKIs, so the history of the PKI, I think really needs to be retold. But then there's also the other part of the book is the emotional part, which Sri and Veronika referenced. And I was thinking about affect, about how readers would receive these stories, and I did think about how to tell stories. And I was very influenced by a novelist. Although it's hard to call him a novelist either, but W.G. Sebald, who I'm sure many of you have heard of. I was reading him in the 1990s before I began this research, and then, the early 2000s, as I was doing it, and also in the 1990s. And the sort of understated quality of his prose, the subtlety of it, I couldn't be as subtle as him, but I did want to avoid a kind of melodrama around it, and sort of use sort of understated description to carry the emotional impact of the story. And that's a sort of third aspect of the book, is the way I designed it, was that to think about the prose style and to have a prose style that was moving. And I've often gotten suspicious of when reviewers just treat the analytical part of the book without mentioning anything about how they felt and reading about it. And I do think that it's something that is difficult for all writers to think about, is just what is the emotional impact of what they're writing? How do they express it? There's so many different kinds of factors involved, so many different considerations to keep in mind. And I don't think I did it all that well, but I did have to think about it in this book rather than in Pretext, which was more of this kind of detached perspective of the detective doing a kind of whodunit thing, where the emphasis is not on the emotions involved here. But this one, as Veronika mentioned, I am dealing with people who are traumatized, and I didn't emphasize trauma in the book. It comes up in one place. I remember when one of the bystanders to a massacre told me he was traumatized just watching it, and he had trouble talking about it, and it was in Bali, and he used it's become an Indonesian word, and it just said, "Saya trauma melihat kejadian itu." So it was one reason I didn't write more about it was because I met other people who were so traumatized they just couldn't speak at all, and it was really hard for me to write about those people, and I didn't. And it was one reason why I didn't write about East Java, was because I interviewed a number of victims in East Java and met a number of them. One of my sort of anthropological moments was attending a shadow puppet theater performance in Surabaya that was organized by the ex-political prisoners. And this would have been 2000 or 2001. And so they were all gathered there on the streets for the whole night and the next day. And I just hung out with them and talked with them and got to know them. And there were so many of them who were just so broken. And it was difficult to speak with them. And I think the killings were so extensive in East Java, and these perpetrators of the NU were still living in those neighborhoods with them, around them, monitoring them, threatening them, and they were just had difficulty communicating what their stories about what had happened. And I thought if I was going to write more about trauma, I'd have to write about all of that experience. And I maybe it's one of the failings of the book is actually I couldn't properly incorporate those kinds of stories. So there's a lot more I would have liked to have said in response to your comments, but I'm out of time. So thank you all very much.
Thank you so much, Don. I have to say there are so many things I would say also, but I would rather have time for the Q&A. But I just want to say thank you so much to all of you. I think the power of the book is precisely that it generated this conversation. That's why it's so remarkable. So there is so far one question in the Q&A, and then there's one that has come via the chat. So again, please, for folks who are listening, please feel free to put more questions in the Q&A. So the question is, can you talk about the juxtaposition between buried histories and living stories of the everyday and the contemporary moment? I'm interested in the current everyday and everyday that is in the ever continuous post-1965-ness of Indonesian
life. I guess I'll, it falls on me too.
It falls on you.
So, yeah, in some ways, there's, you can sort of view everything in Indonesia today as an outcome of what happened in '65. In a sense, you can see it quite clearly in the act of killing where Joshua Oppenheimer used these images of the malls in Medan, the consumerism, the sort of zombie-like quality of people in the malls, being caught in the now. In the malls are, are sort of historyless and generic as well. So that is one product of the economic development of the style of economic development of post-1965. And it's one that many of the perpetrators were able to profit from. So I think so much of the now is to escape that history as well, and for the victim survivors as well. There's been, for many of them, a desire to not have to go back to that path. Many of the survivors didn't tell their children about their stories of suffering. They didn't want to burden the children. They wanted the children just to adjust to the current reality and allow the children to learn all those stupid stories that Sri and Veronika mentioned in the schools. And so there's been a kind of great loss of historical memory. And that, I think one of the problems is the lack of historical referencing when it comes to discourse in Indonesia. It's always sort of, especially when I'm in Indonesia, speaking with Indonesians, the conversation tends to what's in the news cycle. And that's true in many other countries as well, and you just sort of get caught up with it. And, it's this kind of history, I think, requires a pause, a break. But in doing so, one can sort of then bring it back to the present. And as Veronika mentioned, the territorial command is one of the ongoing present day realities that probably will extend far into the future. And that's what I brought out in the first chapter of the book. And I think that's a key issue for being able to create a different environment in Indonesia such that this history of 65, 66 could be revisited.
Thank you so much. So now there are a number of questions are arriving in both the chat and the Q&A. So why don't we go to the question in the Q&A from, could you comment on the Jokowi government's recent acknowledgement of regrettable cases of human rights violations, including the PKI massacres? Do you see any change in the possibility for accountability growing in recent years?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a lot could be said about that, but I guess I don't see any possibility for accountability, meaning I don't think anybody's going to be punished, and that anybody's going to be put on trial for this. The cases are too far back, and so many of the people have passed away, and the evidence is actually really thin for, connecting any particular person. And I don't think individual trials are really all that useful for this event. I've always been prioritizing historical clarification and just trying to get at a place where we could have more evidence about what happened, so that there could be more exhumations of mass graves. And that's a kind of humanitarian issue. And that actually is something that Jokowi has been willing to allow. He started to allow it in 2016, and then was cut short by this crisis with the Islam Kanan and the FPI and so forth. And that was but I think Jokowi himself has been willing to allow some of this history, given that he's from Surakarta, and he himself knows quite a bit about that history of the PKI in Central Java. And I think his statement, while it was widely criticized as being, ineffectual, I think it did open the space for some of the victims to say, this is what we want to do. We want to find out more information. Let's exhume mass graves. Let's conduct more investigations. And I think Jokowi himself and his cabinet is not so much opposed to that. The military is another matter. The army is another matter. So I think it's better than nothing.
That question, I just have to say, is so relevant across. It's so relevant across the whole region. It's really, and in this current political moment, it's so striking. One of the questions that came in the chat is a challenging one. The pervasive and lasting influence of the Enlightenment installed the presumption that to know is a fundamental good, and much of the critically driven scholarship in particular, and modern scholarship in general, is based on this premise. This presumption exiles not knowing as a non-option, and anyone who opts to take this path is ignored as stupid or vilified as irresponsible. I understand and appreciate very much the social justice aspiration of critical works on 1965-66, but I wonder if there is a need to rethink the notion of social justice in this case. It is easy to understand that the victims deserve justice, but I wonder if unburying the painful history of the 65-66 might create unintended potential victims about which many Indonesians are aware, and which is why they hesitate to agree with the need to unbury buried histories. I guess my question boils down to whether knowing or remembering ought to be the default. Can one who opts to forget and move on be faulted for their choice?
Maybe I'll take an initial stab at this, and then others could comment if they'd like.
Maybe you could speak, and then everybody could say a last word or two, and then that would be a good place to wrap up. Does that sound good?
Sure. Sure.
Okay.
My work began with oral interviews of the ex-political prisoners and their families in 2000. And for them, it was important to understand what happened and to have other Indonesians understand what happened, meaning they were very much concerned about how they were seen in the society. They were stigmatized, they were demonized, they were treated as evil, and they wanted to be able to, have a different narrative to present. And there's different ways of accomplishing that. Changing how the September 30th movement event was told was one. And I think this is dealing with the mass killings is another, dealing with the history of the PKI is another way of dealing with that. So it's sort of, we already are faced with a violence of official knowledge. That official knowledge is doing harm right now. And so I see what I've been doing and my colleagues have been doing as a way of trying to resist that, the harm that's already being done. And for instance, when I was in Bali, and there were not many ex-political prisoners to interview in Bali, and they told me, you should go interview the perpetrators because we don't really understand how they see it. And we haven't talked with them, and we don't want to talk with them, but you're a foreigner and you can. And so I showed up at their houses, these sort of well-known perpetrators, and the victims wanted to know this. And so while there are many of these victim survivors who, as I said, they've had to suppress their knowledge in order to get along, in order to comply with these bersih lingkungan laws, clean environment laws, and they've had to forget. But so many of the people that I interviewed would initially say, it's really uncomfortable. But then once talking about it, they would think this is important. And the fellow who I mentioned before, who said he was traumatized, and he had very great difficulty in speaking about it, but yet he wanted to. And he came up, I saw him at the ceremony another day, and he came up to me and said, he was very eager to say, this is what happened here, this is what happened here. And I think every society has a way of, there's different, it's not so much forgetting and remembering as we're working through is what I've been thinking about it. And that sometimes is painful for some people to undergo, but and I haven't been involved myself in imposing anything that I'm proposing certain ways of understanding what happened and bringing out voices. of certain people who have been suppressed and marginalized. And I myself was often scared about dealing with certain people in this story, and I avoided dealing with some of the people I won't mention. So anyway, I think that I've spoken long enough about that.
Thank you so much. So I thought that what we could do with the last 8 minutes is just ask Shri and then Chris and Veronika to say a last word or two. If you would like, you can say that you want to pass. That's also okay.
Yeah, I just want to respond to the previous question, but also to say a few things about forgetting and remembering. I think in the case of Indonesia, forgetting is really the privilege of the powerful. That for those who are suppressed or killed and dominated, like forgetting is really hard thing to do. And actually in Indonesia, the entire structure of impunity is built on this, false remembering that, that we had, that the communists were bad, communists were, were involved in the coup in 1965. So I think it's really like the book really open up like there's so many questions to me as an Indonesian, as an anthropologist about like what remembering means and forgetting means, right? Especially where the entire structure and the entire structure of silence, of impunity is still there, is still in the country, and it's something that we experience every day. So I think in regard to that, the connection between the histories and living stories. I mean, of course we have like these stories, but it's also like really, it's maybe a way to walking through that. But we want the truth. Like we want to see, like how we as Indonesian like come into this thing, like why like so many atrocities committed by our government or by our army, just like go without like any responsibilities. There is no accountability. So I think the meaning of social justice is not only about the past and but the strengthening the past, but also for the present, but how we as a nation has still to deal with all of this, with the entire structure of the silence and injustices. Thank you.
Yeah, if I could comment on that, it's a very elegantly posed question, and one that I see often, where the breaking down the question in order to allow people to forget is taken into an individual case study, right? Where I don't believe anything said today is necessarily going to allow or is meant to disallow somebody to forget and move on from difficult moments in their past. But the question is not whether we should presume the fundamental good of knowing something, but whether we should presume the fundamental good is preventing others from knowing something. It is not a passive engagement where you simply allow people to remember or forget, but there is an active history through the state-driven forces that force people to forget and then replace what they would remember with other information. So there is a forced remembering on top of a forced forgetting. So it is not necessarily a question of thinking any individual stupid or lesser for wanting to move on. It is a question beyond that at a state level of what you can allow to occur naturally. So if we are speaking of social justice, I would not say it's necessarily to force each individual person to recount these memories, which, as Jean mentioned, sometimes they're hesitant and then it works out well for them. But the social justice in the movement is to allow people to recount these memories and allow them to work in a natural manner, which is part of the healing process, which currently and for the last 50 years has not been possible.
I just want to second everyone here. Like, I happen to met some of these people in Bali who was the subject of the 40 Years of Silence film, and the stories that they told me, the injustice that they had to suffer, it's not only about them, but it's also like with their family, like their children couldn't serve as a civil servant, for example, and they lost their houses, and like nobody even like think about their loss. And then now that, yeah, I think everyone has the right to decide whether they want to forget or they want to remember, but we need the state to allow us to do that. Because I know some of my friends, when I went to Aceh, they told me they're trying to hold a film screening of all the of the film about 65. And then suddenly, like, the army officer came and told them, you're not allowed to do that. So the access to this information, the freedom to get information about it, that's what we needed before like telling people whether to forget or to remember.
Thank you so much. We're coming up sort of at the time where we should conclude, and I know it's late for folks who are who are in North America, or it's morning in Asia where people may need to go to the next point of their day. I want to end by echoing the comments of all four colleagues on, in a sense, the urgency of remembering and this question of who gets to remember and who gets to forget, and do so in the context of talking about the importance of the book one more time, which is that I gave, after Pretext to Mass Murder came out, I gave it to Thai colleagues who suggested that they may find it useful, and actually was very hopeful that it would be translated into Thai, perhaps one day. But I did the same with Buried History, because the kinds of enforced silences and the way in which John Roosa models the multiple ways of breaking them in the book, I think, is so resonant for victims, survivors, and their descendants who have been affected by state violence in Thailand. And I think I guess I can't say sort of enough things about the book as someone who is not Indonesian and who doesn't study Indonesia. The urgency of the book, it's that I feel as though it is a book that anybody who is concerned about the relationship between writing history and challenging impunity, about documenting the past in a way that is just, absolutely has to read the book. Whether or not they're concerned with the specificity of Indonesia, they should be, but even if they're not, my argument is you must read this book, because it will teach you how to write and research and feel more humanly, I think that's a word, in whatever context one is working. And I sort of thinking of John's comment about the exploitation in the time of the crisis of the humanities for humanities scholars to become more social scientific. My feeling is that this book is an absolutely excellent example of why the humanities must be supported. It is exactly the reason why it is so necessary. So with a final thanks to John and to Sri and to Chris and Veronika and to all of the audience for joining us and for asking great questions. If you haven't yet bought and read the book, you can do so through the University of Wisconsin Press webpage, or through through the gigantic bookseller, global bookseller whose name must not be spoken, or ordered through your favorite independent bookseller. But please read the book, think about it, be unsettled by it, as clearly all four of us, in addition to John, were. And thank you so much.
Thank you, everyone, and especially Tyrell.
Thank you much.
Thank you.